This week, Margot Livesey's Baby, Michael Ridpath's Trade, Robert Llewellyn's Hair, and Edna O'Brien. That's the book show.
Words on a page, words on a line, words unspoken, read between the lines, just words.
Hasta la vista.
Words to inspire, words to tell a lie, words that you twist, read between the lines. Words never pale, words never die, words forever, read between the lines. Just words.
Hello, she's famous for creamy and evocative writing with a tremendous track record over more years than a lady should be asked to remember. There's a new novel out from Edna O'Brien. Edna, welcome. Dare I ask you, how many novels? Or do you know?
I think about maybe 12 or 13 or 14 or something, I think.
Plus collections of short stories?
Plus collections of short stories, some plays, a play about Virginia Woolf, and I've just written a play about Maud Gonne, and Yeats, of course, and The Men Who Loved Her. I love working, you see. Somebody said to me yesterday, where would you go if you were offered a holiday? And I said I couldn't. I just couldn't. It's like an athlete. If you stop writing, or if you lose your pace, then that's dangerous. And I would be in dread of that.
Every time I open a book of yours, whether it's a new one, which we'll talk about in a moment, or something from the past, I'm always aware of a desire on your part to use the English language as fully as a person can use it.
Yes, I'm thankful to you for that, because it is a compliment. The English language, any language, but the English language is so rich. And to take it, I mean, James Joyce is one's great master, and William Faulkner. And what they did, they're like ativars with the words. Now, a lot of English, including English critics, or they call themselves critics, don't really like or admire that. They go more for the tepid stuff. Well, too bad, too bad. The richness, the vigor, the power, and above all, the magic that a sequence of words, I mean, it's like Aurora Borealis.
But you come from a part of Ireland, from the west of Ireland, where English was not the traditional language. So therefore, is there a sense in which you have had, genetically almost, to master this new language called English?
I think Celtic people, and perhaps more so in the west of Ireland, use English, or in more what Elizabethan English was, the syntax, and the vividness, and not being ashamed of the glory of it. So that, yes, Irish and English I learned simultaneously.
And no words in the Irish language for yes, no, or sex?
Well, I'm not surprised by the third one.
Which brings us to your new novel, Down by the River.
Yes.
Tell me the story.
I'm to tell you the story.
Yes, please.
Well, I'll tell you how it begins. Ahead of them, the road lay in a long undulation of mud, patched tar, and fjords of green. Once I had those two lines, and I had a father and a young daughter, and she has a can to pick blackberries. And he is full of excitement because he's going to make some money out of selling bits of bog to innocent people across Europe. He thinks he is. And it says, and then I'm not dodging the story, it says, the sound of the traffic growing fainter and fainter, a clackety river beyond. They rode, silent, somnolent, yet with a speech of its own, speaking back up to them, father and child, of the old mutinies and a fresh crime mounting in the blood.
What's the crime?
And the crime is the father's both desire for and actually consummation, or if that's the right word. Sex, you see, it's too early in the morning to think, with this young girl who does not fully know what has happened to her. She knows and yet doesn't know. She washes herself in salt water in a river. And what happens, what commences on that road and then continues, there are only two actually there are three, if you like, sexual and visceral scenes. What happens then becomes the property of the entire country. The judiciary, the church, the pro-life, the militants, and this girl to whom the real story is happening barely has a voice.
There's an interesting development in your career. Your last novel was about a gunman on the run.
Yes.
This novel echoes the kind of family crime, incest, sexual abuse that has also been making headlines in Ireland in the last few years.
Yes.
Is there a sense in which you have changed from those passionate lyrical novels, even though this is still passionate and lyrical, to becoming a kind of commentator on your own country?
Well, Colette, I think it was, who said, change or die. I have changed. I've got a tiny little bit braver, and that's not said arrogantly. And I also feel that the themes that are going on around us, so long as they have an internal resonance, that it is my duty as well as my privilege to be able to write about them. I couldn't do it, though, unless it touched an emotional chord inside me.
You see, I look back over your track record. I think I've read most of what you've read, including the Mrs. Reinhardt stories and that marvellous moment when your career changed, when you started to write about England as well as Ireland. I think writing is about the hardest job anyone can do. Do you find it hard work?
Nightmare. It's all the cliches one says. It's lonely, it's hard. You need enormous faith in yourself, hope. We forget charity.
There's none of that around.
And I think it gets harder because you are more scrupulous, more is expected of you by yourself and maybe others. And also I would like, my son Sasha said to me, you've written these 2 books now about Ireland in this last decade. You must now find a third one with a theme as deep and as raw as the 2 themes of House of Splendid Isolation is the war and the tragedy of the North. Down by the River is the tragedy and the bewilderment of incest, of sexual covertness, of crime.
Since The Country Girls, more years ago than we would dare mention,
Doesn't matter.
Amazing success, which has continued ever since, almost unabated. Look across all that work now and finally tell me, how would you describe the woman that has been writing these books?
The woman who began was a frightened convent girl with a bursting hunger for life, language, and truth. And with some obstacle and some help, she taught herself to keep going and to make it richer, richer, richer.
There's nothing else to say, except that this book is called Down by the River. It's published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson. Edna O'Brien, thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks a lot.
Right, one by one they step forward. Earlier this year, we had the creator of Red Dwarf, Rob Grant, writing a novel. Now it's the turn of Robert Llewellyn, who plays Crichton in the cult series, to hark back to his wistful past, when thin he was and filthy-haired in joy-riding years of living dangerously.
I could sit on my hair, so if I had to put my head back like that, but I could actually sit on my hair. I had 1 pair of jeans in the world and about 3 T-shirts and a pair of very dilapidated snakeskin boots that I bought in Kensington Market, and no money at all, but deliberately so. I mean, I came from a family that weren't wealthy, but were certainly comfortably off, and I chose to be poor and to live without money and, you know, deny everything about the society I was brought up in, reject it all, throw it all away, not have anything to do with any of it, initially. I left home and moved into a squat in Oxford. And everyone expected me, my friends, my parents, everyone expected me to sort of stay there 3 weeks and go back home, and because of circumstances and life, I didn't, so that was it. And I immediately got very sick as soon as I went away, because I forgot to do things like eating and washing, which are fairly essential human activities. So I got very, very ill, got even thinner than I was to start with, but somehow managed to survive and came out of that, and eventually fell in with a group of people who are far more organised than the no-hoper studes and dropouts that I was living with, and eventually started to build a sort of life, which really, by the time I was 17, I was self-employed, in effect. I was making leather goods, which were very popular at those times, sort of hippie headbands and wristbands and belt pouches and things like that. I've always loved living in the country, so what my fantasy was, I think, to live in a big commune with lots of people of my age and have sex and build windmills and geodesic domes and grow food and play music and live this sort of idyllic, weird life, which I was convinced was in existence somewhere. And there were books around at the time about, particularly about America, about the youth movement in America at that time, which depicted sort of amazing geodesic dome communes in the Nevada desert, where like 40 families would live and on different platforms in this massive dome. And I mean, these things, in my mind, these things were sort of a permanent fixture that had been there for years. In truth, they lasted about 3 months till someone attacked someone else with a machete and the whole thing fell apart. You know, they're all drug-crazed loonies. The women found me peculiar because I'd prefer to look after kids and cook than sit around getting stoned and telling ludicrous stories, you know, which is really all the men seem to do. So, and also the place was such a mess and such a tip and so cold. This was over New Year's Eve, 1973. It was bitterly cold. And they did have a fire, but it was a pathetic fire that was never really got, you know, no one ever got the fire together. I mean, it's very much sort of Neil from the Young Ones, you know, at home. Ironically, the one man I met in that time who showed me enormous friendship and loyalty was the guy who stole cars and was an immensely loyal man. And because he told the truth, strange enough, once we were arrested, the truth about my involvement in the crime spree, if you like, I didn't go to prison. I've had more cars stolen and smashed up than I care to remember, which is one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, because I've never been angry. Whenever I found my car gutted, with its speakers hanging out the doors, I've just thought, well, that's my fault, I deserve it, you know. But I think I must have had payback, almost, by now.
Thin He Was and Filthy Haired, Memoirs of a Bad Boy by Robert Llewellyn, is published by Penguin. After the break, Margot Livesey's thrilling novel, Michael Ridpath's novel thriller, plus a bestsellers list. There haven't been that many thrillers about the city as we know it today, have there?
No, there haven't, and I'm surprised. There's really quite a lot to write about in finance.
How do they respond to your first novel, Free to Trade?
I think a lot of people liked it. They thought that finally someone was explaining what they did, what was exciting about it, and also what was slightly sleazy about it as well.
Are you drawing entirely on experience for these novels, or are you doing additional research?
Well, the first book, Free to Trade, was entirely from my experience. I was writing at weekends in the evening. The second book, which is about a virtual reality company as well as the city, I involved quite a lot of research. And I found myself enjoying stretching out a little bit beyond my own experience.
It's like the first one, it's peopled by people on the edge all the time. Is that how life in the city is?
Yes, it is. You never really know who you can trust. There aren't actually that many murderers around in the city, from what I can tell. But it's quite hard to tell what's honest and what's dishonest. There are shades of grey, and people are always stretching the borders of ethics.
What's the core story of Trading Reality?
It's about a bond trader in the city called Mark. His brother has founded a virtual reality company, a company that makes virtual reality systems in Scotland. The brother gets murdered, and Mark finds himself taking over this company in Scotland. And he discovers that there are other people also trying to take it over, the Japanese, the Americans. He doesn't know who he can trust in the company. And he also finds that there's something in this company that could make it really worth something in the future.
So what you do as a writer then is you drop people into waters above their depth.
Yes, waters that they don't quite understand and which they learn about as the book progresses, so hopefully the reader can learn about it with them.
So is your basic premise of writing these novels, is it, what if this happened to me?
Yes, that's right, yes. How would I react in this circumstance? Or more than how would I react, how would I like to be able to react? I mean, I think my heroes are what I'd like to be rather than necessarily what I am.
The trappings are as one would expect, the BMWs and all of that. How much is that an essential part of the life of somebody who works in the city? Does he need these badges?
It's not necessarily. Some do, and some don't. The people I like to write about don't. I mean, they tend to be in the city because they find the work interesting. And I have difficulty, actually, with writing about a hero convincingly, he has to have a BMW and the other trappings of the city, otherwise he isn't a real city person.
But he's not what you want,
No.
basically.
No.
Why not?
I suppose I went into finance genuinely because I found it interesting, because I enjoyed it. I found some of the trappings and the conspicuous consumption and salaries, I suppose, a little distasteful, personally. And part of what I wanted to show with Free to Trade, my first book, was that not everyone in the city was just in it for the money and in it for the BMWs.
In both Free to Trade and Trading Reality, you have exactly the same principle working, it works very well, which is somebody quite innocently resisting corruption. Is that the position you found yourself having to take in the city?
In a very minor way, perhaps. In the bond markets, there are tremendous temptations to tell half-truths, to be slightly dishonest, which gives you some short-term gain, but can damage your reputation in the long run. And I always found it quite interesting and often a sort of personal challenge, trying to play it straight all the way through. I mean, it sounds very moralistic, but authors, especially thriller authors, tend to be moralistic, and I suppose that's where mine comes from.
There is an obvious question arising out of Trading Reality. You chose a company that creates virtual reality. Are you saying that the city, with its huge money and its larger-than-life characters, is not real life, but it's virtual reality?
Well, I call the book Trading Reality. You could almost call it Trading Unreality. This chap works in the city, fiddling around with computer money, which is just stored in computers and you never really see. And then he moves into a company which is dealing in virtual reality, neither of which is really real. And in both cases, he's sort of sloshing around in a world which doesn't have any sort of physical substance you can put your hands on.
You've watched people in the city both making massive amounts of money, personal money unto themselves, and equally losing it. In which circumstance are people more interesting, winning or losing?
Losing. It's easy to, well, it's not necessarily easy to make money, but everyone makes money sometimes. Luck suggests that you will make money, and you feel great when it's happening. Good traders respond well under pressure, and a good trader is one who can handle a serious loss well, basically cut their losses early. Bad traders don't, and Nick Leeson at Barings is the ultimate bad trader who managed to double up until everything blew up.
This novel is called Trading Reality. It's published by Heinemann. Michael Ridpath, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Now, let's have a look at this week's best-selling hardback fiction. At number 10 is The Solitaire Mystery by Justin Gorder. Number 9 is Jilly Cooper, Appassionata. Number 8, A Crown of Swords by Robert Jordan. Number 7 is Danielle Steele with Malice. Number 6, Terry Pratchett, Feet of Clay. Number 5, Jeffrey Archer, The Fourth Estate. Number 4, The X-Files 4, Ruins by Kevin J. Anderson. Number 3 is John Grisham, The Runaway Jury. Number 2, Boy Stuff, Chris Ryan, Stand By, Stand By. And at number 1, Popcorn by Ben Elton. Ben Elton still riding high. Finally this week, a sharply observed novel with the pace of a thriller. Man finds abandoned baby, doesn't hand it into the police, involves his dysfunctional sister, and thereby unfolds a tale called Criminals by Margot Livesey. Margot, it's so difficult now to classify books, but you run in danger of having a serious novel classified as a thriller. Does that bother you?
Well, it's controversial for me, to put it mildly, and I mean, I did worry that people would come to the book with expectations of more violence, of gunplay, I don't know quite what, big money crimes. And I think most of my characters are criminals, but in a much more human, everyday way. I mean, they're criminals like I'm a criminal. So I do worry that the label thriller is a wee bit misleading, but at the same time, I hope it suggests a book people might want to read.
It's a story of an essentially decent man, a young banker, who, on the spur of the moment, doesn't do what he should have done, which is go to the police, and thereby catches himself up in the webs of other people's lives. Why did that appeal to you?
Well, I think I'm interested in bad behavior of all kinds, but I'm particularly interested in the kind of bad behavior that comes from inattention. You know, you just fail to be looking in the right direction, you fail to do the right thing, you fail to tell the truth, and you're gone.
Tell me a little about yourself. From Scotland, living in the States?
I grew up in a quite remote part of Scotland. It was actually a boys' public school called Glenalmond, So my early landscape was peopled by sheep and boys in kilts, both of which struck me as about equally interesting. I lived there really more or less until I was 18, when I went to the University of York to study English and philosophy. And after I graduated, I started spending more and more time in North America. And mostly I make a living by teaching there, although I still spend a lot of time in London and Scotland.
Do you teach writing?
I do, yes.
Because you've obviously thought a lot about writing.
Yeah.
A couple of things about this book. Very few characters.
And that was part of the scheme. I wanted a few characters to whom I could pay a lot of attention.
Why?
I think that struck me as part of the purpose of a novel. I mean, I've always loved Jane Austen, for example, and her closed world. I didn't want my world to be that closed, but I did want that quality of attention.
There's a sense in which you almost suggest, though, by writing this book in this way, that a lot of modern novels have too many characters.
I certainly don't mean to suggest that. I love the highly peopled novels, and I envy them. I hope I'll go on to write one of them someday.
The other thing that's hugely interesting about this book is much of the action of the book, the internal, mental, psychological action, depends upon another book that one of the characters has written. Like A.S. Meyer did in Possession, you've created other literature within your own. Why do you do that?
Well, I think that I got to a certain part in the novel and I was very worried that I was sort of pointing the finger at everyone and letting myself off scot-free. I mean, I was living with these characters and saying, you're to blame and you're to blame and you're behaving badly, you know, and I'm the saintly writer. And the crime I commit most often, sometimes on a daily basis, is writing about people I know. So I wanted to have a writer do that within the novel.
How do you go about characterizing a baby? It's so difficult to do, isn't it?
Well, not having a baby myself, I did research, which mainly involved babysitting for my friends and waiting for their babies to reach the right age, rushing over, you know, to be a wonderful aunt for a few weeks and then saying, oh, too old now. I need somebody else who's 4 months old.
Because Olivia, the baby, is very closely observed.
Yeah, I like to think so, yes. Long hours of taking notes.
Did you make notes?
I did, yes.
As you babysat?
As I babysat.
And what sort of notes did you make?
I said, oh, now you're picking up your rat, or oh, now you're smiling, now you're thinking about nuclear physics.
In the end, it's not so much that people get their comeuppance as they come to their own realizations. Is that how you think life works out?
I think it's sometimes how life works out. I was very anxious that this book should not end with a court case. I wanted, in effect, the reader to be the judge and the characters to judge themselves rather than to end up in, I don't know, some sort of Perry Mason situation. So people are hoisted by their own petard rather than by the forces of law and order.
It's called Criminals. It's published by Sickra and Warburg. Margot Livesey, thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank.
In a word, recommended. On the book show next week, the latest from Frederick Forsyth, the official Life of Fred West from Geoffrey Wansell, and the Booker Prize-winning author Barry Unsworth. Until then, goodbye.
Words on a page, words on a line.